My name is Geraldine May Carter, and I am 74 years old. I wasn't always Geraldine. Once, long ago, I was Jerry to my friends in college, Dee to my late husband, and simply Mom to my son, Daniel. Time shifts things names, roles, relevance. These days, most people just call me Mrs. Carter, if they remember at all. At the community center, I'm the one who organizes the monthly reading circle. At the pharmacy, I'm the quiet woman who always has her loyalty card ready. But here in this house, my son's house, I am simply Mom, a word now used more out of convenience than affection. 3 years ago, Daniel and Julia, his wife, invited me to move in after Richard passed. I wasn't grieving loudly, I never have. But the days were hollow and the nights were long. Daniel said they had space, that I'd be helping them while they worked and raised the kids. I believed him. I wanted to. He made it sound like family. They had just moved into a modest 3-bedroom bungalow in a quiet cul-de-sac in Eastwood. Julia called it their forever home. I was given the smallest room, next to the laundry, just large enough for a bed, a chair, and a narrow dresser that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I brought a few things: a photo of Richard and me in Maine, a wooden box of letters, some sweaters I knew I wouldn't wear but couldn't let go of. The rest stayed in storage or was quietly discarded during the move. I didn't protest. I paid for the washer and dryer when theirs broke. I covered half the cost of the new patio. When the kids needed new winter coats, I offered before anyone had to ask. That's what mothers do, right? We fill in the gaps, patch up the holes in silence. Every morning I made breakfast while Julia packed the school lunches. I folded laundry, kept the plants alive, and listened when the children came home with stories about gym class and missing pencils. On weekends, I offered to babysit so they could go out. Sometimes they did. More often, they stayed in and asked me to keep the kids entertained anyway. There were moments, small and fleeting, when Daniel would thank me. A passing hand on my shoulder, a glance of acknowledgement when dinner turned out especially well. But more and more I noticed I was becoming quieter, not by force, but by erosion. Conversations went on without me. Plans were made around me, not with me. One evening last fall, I returned from my weekly knitting circle to find they had rearranged the living room. My chair, an old armchair Daniel once spilled juice on as a toddler, was gone. When I asked, Julia said lightly, "It was too bulky. We donated it. I'm sure you understand." I nodded. I always nodded. There seemed to be fewer and fewer places for me in this house, but I never said anything. After all, it was their home. I was just helping until the day I saw the box. It began in the quiet gray stillness of morning, the kind of morning where the house hums before anyone speaks. I had already been awake for hours, as I often was. The arthritis in my right knee never let me sleep in, and the sound of the water heater clicking on was always my cue to rise. By the time sunlight filtered through the blinds, I was in the kitchen, sipping weak tea and listening to the small, familiar groans of a house stretching into its day. The hallway outside the kitchen had been cleared the night before. Julia had mentioned something about making more space. That phrase had started appearing more frequently. More space, less clutter, less dust, less noise, less me. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was about the kids' toys, or perhaps another shelving unit they planned to install from IKEA. But when I stepped into the hallway, still in my house slippers, I stopped short. There it was, a cardboard box, medium-sized, taped lightly at the bottom, but open at the top. It was positioned neatly against the wall, like an offering, or an instruction. There was a note on it, a square of paper torn from Julia's shopping list pad, with her familiar loopy handwriting. "Mom, here are your old things. Please sort it out before tonight. We need to make room." No greeting, no signature, just a soft directive, the way you might leave a note for the dry cleaner or the plumber. I stared at it for longer than I needed to, the way one might stare at an unopened letter from a doctor or a lawyer. Not because the contents were unknown, but because you already knew, because something in your chest whispered, "This is going to change something." I sat down slowly on the narrow bench beside the coat rack, my knees grateful for the rest, and looked inside. On top was a photo of Richard and me on our wedding day. It was the original print, the one that had once sat in a silver frame on the mantel of our old house. Beneath it were layers of items, yellowing greeting cards, letters in my handwriting, school drawings from Daniel's kindergarten years, a brooch shaped like a swallow I used to wear on church Sundays, an old Reader's Digest with a corner turned down on a recipe I never made. All of it had once been part of something, part of me. I pulled out a folded linen napkin and recognized the embroidery. It had been part of our anniversary set, something we brought back from Quebec. Daniel must have been 11 then. He had spilled gravy on it and cried because he thought it was ruined. I had laughed and told him it gave the napkin character. There it was, stained, folded, discarded into this cardboard reliquary. I didn't hear Julia come down the hall. She was holding her phone and a coffee cup and paused only slightly when she saw me. "Oh, good," she said breezily. "You found it." I nodded. "We're just trying to clear up before the movers come this weekend. You know how clutter adds up. We thought you might want to go through it and see what's worth keeping. Just, maybe not in the closet. We're really short on storage." I nodded again. My voice didn't come. It wasn't that I didn't want to speak. It just felt, in that moment, like I might shatter if I did. She was already halfway down the stairs when I finally said, "Of course." The words felt foreign, not because I didn't mean them, but because I realized I had said, "of course," so many times in this house that it no longer felt like a response. It was a reflex. I sat for another 10 minutes. Maybe more. The tea had gone cold in the kitchen. I could hear the sound of the kids arguing over cereal upstairs, and Daniel's voice gently telling them to quiet down. I waited for him to come say something. Anything. He didn't. Eventually, I stood. I lifted the box. It wasn't heavy, but it was dense. Not with weight, but with something else. Time, maybe, or grief, or the long, slow erosion of mattering. I could have taken it back to my room, or stored it in the garage, or left it untouched as a silent protest. But instead, I went to my closet, found a sweater, and picked up my purse. The box came with me. When I opened the front door, the air had the brittle crispness of late fall, the kind of weather that carried the scent of smoke and earth. Leaves had started to curl on the pavement. I walked to the corner slowly, past the stone planters I'd filled last spring with pansies and marigolds, past the crack in the sidewalk where the kids always jumped like it was a canyon. The bus came on time. I placed the box carefully on the seat beside me, as though it were something fragile or holy. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing. I wasn't bringing that box back to this house. Not after the note, not after Julia's tone, not after Daniel said nothing. The downtown library stood like an old friend, worn around the edges, but still upright and solid. It had been renovated 5 years ago, but the central reading room remained intact. It still smelled like dust and paper and glue. I stepped inside with the box. A young woman behind the help desk looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. I hesitated. Then I said, "I was wondering if you accept personal archives, family collections, letters, photographs, that sort of thing." She looked surprised but curious. "We do sometimes. Local histories. It depends on what you have." I nodded toward the box. "May I show someone?" She disappeared behind a door and returned with a man in his 50s, bespectacled and warm-eyed, with a lanyard around his neck and a pen tucked into his shirt pocket. I'm Stephen, he said, and gestured to a nearby table. Let's have a look. One by one, I took the items out. I spoke softly but with intention. I told him about Richard, about our wedding, about the picnic where that photo was taken. I showed him Daniel's childhood drawings, the fire truck, the treehouse, the portrait he'd drawn of me with a crown. I held up the brooch and explained it came from my mother. I unfolded the napkin and told him about Quebec. Stephen didn't rush. He listened, really listened. At one point, he said, "This is remarkable." I blinked. "It's just my life." He smiled gently. "That's what makes it so important. These stories, they're the threads that make up a town's memory. People forget that." I didn't say anything. My throat was tight. He told me they could accept it, that they had a local history collection, and that this, if I was willing, could be cataloged, preserved, used by future generations. He said it could even be digitized. I nodded. Yes, I'd like that. Would you be willing to write some descriptions, even brief ones? Context is everything. Yes, I said again, this time with more strength. As I signed the paperwork, I felt something strange and light spread through my chest. A loosening, a reclaiming. I had not lost anything. I had relocated it. I had not been erased. I had been archived. When I left the library, my arms were empty, but I felt taller. The sun was beginning to set when I got back on the bus. My seat felt different, less like retreat, more like travel, like forward. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman who had just found something to do with her box of memories. Evening came early that time of year. Shadows stretched longer across the driveway as I stepped off the bus, my coat buttoned high and my hands in my pockets, though I carried no bag now. The air had shifted, cooler, quieter, as if the world was holding its breath with me. The box was no longer with me, but I could still feel its weight, not on my arms, but somewhere deeper, in my chest, in my ribs, like a part of me had been excavated and set gently aside in a place where it could finally be seen. I stood outside Daniel and Julia's house for a moment longer than usual. The porch light was on. The hallway window glowed faintly. I imagined them inside. Julia probably rinsing dishes. Daniel on the couch with one of the kids tucked under his arm. The television murmuring a quiet lullaby of sitcom laughter. The door opened before I touched the knob. "There you are," Daniel said. "I was wondering where you went." I stepped inside. The smell of baked pasta and warm bread clung to the air. And something else, too. Cinnamon, perhaps. Or nutmeg. Something cozy. "Did you sort through it?" he asked. He nodded in the vague direction of where the box had been. "Yes," I said calmly, unbuttoning my coat. He smiled, almost distracted. "Great. We just didn't want to lose anything important." I held his gaze for a moment, waiting. But nothing else came. No curiosity, no questions, just a smile. "It's all in its place now," I said. "Good," he replied, turning slightly as Julia called from the kitchen. I walked past him into the house, my feet light as if I had been untethered. The kids were playing a board game at the dining table. They waved and went back to their squabble over Monopoly money. I gave them each a gentle pat on the head as I passed. Dinner was served soon after. Julia placed a dish in front of me with the same mechanical kindness she always used. No one asked me where I'd been. No one mentioned the box again. But I noticed, as I cleared my plate and folded my napkin, that Daniel looked at me once or twice with something unreadable behind his eyes. Not guilt, not exactly, but maybe a flicker of curiosity. Or was it discomfort? I didn't force it. I didn't say, "I took our entire family history and gave it to the city archives." I didn't explain that I had turned our lives into a narrative. framed and tagged and preserved for strangers to study long after we were gone. I didn't say it because no one had asked. They hadn't asked in a long time. That night in my small room, I didn't unpack anything. There was nothing to unpack. Instead, I wrote. I began by making notes for the archivist, descriptions for each photo, dates where I could recall them, little captions for each drawing, each letter, each memento. I told the stories no one else had thought to ask about. I wrote about the year Daniel learned to ride a bike and how we both scraped our knees that day. I wrote about the time Richard and I danced under broken fairy lights in our backyard while Daniel watched from the kitchen window, grinning. I wrote until my fingers ached, and then I slept more peacefully than I had in weeks. The next few days passed quietly. I took the kids to the park. I folded more laundry. I trimmed the dead leaves off the ficus by the window. But something in me had shifted. I was still here, but I no longer waited for permission to matter. The box was gone, but my voice was not, and soon others would hear it. The following Monday, I returned to the library, this time with a proper folder and my reading glasses. Stephen greeted me with the same warmth as before, like I was not just a visitor, but someone who had brought something valuable, and not only in paper form. I started working on the materials, I told him, as he led me past the help desk and into the small room marked Special Collections, Local Histories. The space was quiet, with high ceilings and floor lamps that bathed the long table in soft golden light. On one end, my box sat just as I had left it, but now with colored index tabs marking categories. Someone had already begun sorting the contents. Stephen motioned for me to sit. We've never had such a complete, intimate account from a single family. The details you've provided, these aren't just names and dates. They're feelings, moments. It's exactly what we try to preserve. I was surprised by how much those words moved me. I opened my folder. Inside were pages I had typed on Daniel's old laptop. He'd left it unused in a drawer, and I borrowed it without a word. There were photographs with captions like, Daniel, age 6, holding his father's hand at the pumpkin patch. Letters annotated with things like, written during the first spring in our new house when the garden was still wild. I had even drawn simple maps showing the layout of our old homes, with notes on where Daniel liked to hide his toys and where Richard read the newspaper every morning. We spent 3 hours that day cataloging. At one point, Stephen asked if I would consider writing a short preface, a personal narrative to frame the archive. You've clearly got a voice, he said. Would you consider telling your story more broadly? I blinked. A story? Yes, not just for us. Maybe for others too. Mothers, widows, grandmothers, people who understand what it means to be present but fading from view. I sat back, letting the idea stretch out inside me. When I left that day, I felt strangely electric, like I'd been plugged into something I hadn't realized I missed. That night, back in my room, I began again. Not just descriptions, but reflections. Sentences that started with I remember and sometimes wandered for paragraphs. I wasn't just documenting, I was reclaiming. By the end of the week, I had finished the preface. I titled it simply, A Box of Memory, A Mother's Chronicle. 2 days later, I brought it in and read it aloud to Stephen. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, he said, This is more than a donation. This is a gift. He asked for my permission to submit it to a local journal on regional histories. They publish stories like this a few times a year. We rarely see something so personal and so complete. I nodded and signed the form. A week after that, they published a notice online. Coming soon, one mother's story in a box. Below it was a scanned photo of Daniel's treehouse drawing, my notes gently printed beside it. I didn't tell my family, not yet, because somehow it didn't feel like theirs anymore. It was mine, and now it belonged to others who might understand it better than those who had tried to box it away. It was a Thursday morning when the article came out. I had just finished watering the potted plants near the sunroom. Julia had all but forgotten about them and was sitting at the kitchen table with my tea and toast when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and neither were they. Julia called from the hallway. "Could you get that, Mom?" As if I were the doorman of a small hotel and not a woman who had once been the very axis of this family's turning world. I opened the door to find a white envelope on the mat. No stamp, no return address, just my name, Geraldine Carter, printed neatly across the front. Inside was a folded copy of the Eastwood Community Review. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it. And there, on page 3, beneath the feature banner, was the title, One Mother's Story in a Box. By Stephen Clark, archivist, Eastwood Library. I read it slowly, line by line, as though reading about someone else. It began with my name, my age, my voice. Geraldine Carter, a lifelong resident of Eastwood, recently donated a collection of personal family artifacts to the local history archives. What makes this archive extraordinary isn't its size, but its soul. There were photos, Daniel's drawing, Richard's candid wedding shot, even the linen napkin with the gravy stain. Stephen had quoted from my notes and prefaced generously. "These items," he wrote, "tell the story of a woman who was always in the room, though the room often forgot her name." I paused at that line. It was true, and seeing it there, in print, made it more real than I'd ever admitted. Further down, he wrote, "Geraldine's donation has sparked plans for a local lives exhibit this spring, an entire section dedicated to personal narratives that speak to the invisible architecture of family and place. Her archive will open it." I didn't cry, not then, but I did fold the paper gently and hold it against my chest for a long while. Later that day, I left it sitting on the kitchen counter. I didn't say anything. It was Daniel who noticed it first. He walked in from work, still tugging off his tie, and picked it up with idle curiosity. At first, I thought he'd skim past it, but I saw him freeze at the title, then read on. His eyes scanned each line faster than mine had, but the effect was visible. The tightening jaw, the faint furrow in his brow. A moment later, he turned the page back to the front and said, "Is this you?" I nodded. "Yes." He looked down again. "Why didn't you tell me?" I stirred my tea. "Because you already gave me everything I needed. The box." He didn't speak. He just stood there, the newspaper still open in his hands, a dozen questions blinking behind his eyes, none of them finding their way to his mouth. Julia walked in, noticed the silence, then the headline. She didn't say anything either. She just pressed her lips into a neutral line and turned away. I didn't follow her. That evening, Daniel came to my room. He knocked softly, something he hadn't done in months. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I answered. "It's just, life got so busy, and you always seemed okay." I was okay, until I wasn't. He sat in the chair across from my bed, the one I had rescued from storage and placed near the window. "I read everything," he said. "All your notes, your stories. You remembered so much. That's what mothers do." He nodded, rubbing the edge of his thumb along the crease in his trousers. After a long pause, he asked, "Is it really going in the exhibit?" "Yes, in the spring. I'd like to take the kids to see it." Something in my chest stirred. Not joy, exactly, not forgiveness, but something gentler, a soft unfurling. "I'd like that," I said. He stood, walked toward the door, then paused. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Thank you for saving it all, even when we didn't see it." He left before I could answer, but I think he heard it anyway. The paper stayed on the kitchen table for days, folded, but not hidden. And for the first time in years, no one tried to put me, or what mattered to me, back in a box. The article changed something, not in the house itself. Julia still forgot I preferred my tea without sugar, and the children still left their socks under the couch. Daniel's shoes remained in the hallway, exactly where I had asked him not to leave them a dozen times. The rhythms of the home didn't shift, but the way they moved around me did. It was subtle at first. Daniel lingered a bit longer when I spoke. He asked me about the library, about what else they might be interested in. Julia offered to help me scan a few more photos if I was still doing that project. They never apologized directly. But then again, neither had I asked for one. Instead, I noticed new openings, small, quiet recognitions. At dinner, Daniel would say, "Mom, you remember that story about Uncle Robert and the truck? Or, what was that recipe you used to make with squash and sage?" As though I had always been the memory keeper, but they were only now realizing the key had been in my hands all along. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't transformation. It was something smaller, realer. One evening, I received a letter in the mail addressed to Ms. Geraldine Carter. The return address was the Eastwood Historical Society. Inside was an invitation, formal and embossed. You are cordially invited to attend the opening of the local Lives exhibition, featuring the archive, A Box of Memory, A Mother's Chronicle. We are honored to showcase your contribution as the centerpiece of this community event. I sat with it for a long time. A centerpiece. The word felt strange. I had not been the centerpiece of anything in years. Most days I felt more like the tablecloth, present, familiar, and forgotten. I placed the invitation on my bedside table. The next day, I began something new. I started a blog. Daniel had helped me set it up one weekend, under the guise of teaching Grandma how to use the internet better. We called it Still Here, Notes from the Quiet Chair. It was simple, no videos, no fancy design. Just my words, the way I always told stories. I wrote about childhood winters, the way my mother smelled of ivory soap and cinnamon, the ache in my knees that came every time it rained. I wrote about being a mother, about being invisible, about being quietly furious and deeply in love with the world that kept passing me by. The first post got 3 views. One was mine. But by the end of the month, I had 40 subscribers. By spring, it was over 500. Strangers, mostly women, mostly my age, began to write back. Comments flooded in. Emails, too. You say what I felt for years. Reading your stories feels like sitting next to my own mother. Thank you. You reminded me I'm still part of something. I wasn't writing for my family anymore. Not for Daniel or Julia or even the grandchildren. I was writing for women who'd been boxed away, who had stopped believing their voices mattered. I was writing for myself, and that, more than anything, was what changed everything. By the time the exhibition rolled around, I was no longer waiting to be included. I had built something of my own, and it wasn't in a hallway. It wasn't in a cardboard box. It was here, in the open, with the light shining directly on it. The day of the exhibit arrived with an early spring sun, mild, uncertain, but generous. It filtered softly through my curtains and warmed the windowsill where the last of winter's frost had finally surrendered. I woke early, not out of nerves, but out of something steadier, readiness. I dressed slowly, choosing a pale blue blouse I hadn't worn in years and a gray wool coat that still held the scent of cedar from the closet. I pinned the swallow brooch to my lapel, not because it matched, but because it had always been mine. Daniel offered to drive me. "I can meet you there," I said. He hesitated. "We'd like to come, together. The kids want to see it too." So we rode in one car, Julia in the front with Daniel, the children in the back with their sneakers tapping the seat backs. I sat beside them, hands folded over my purse. They were unusually quiet, as if sensing the weight of the day. The library was dressed for the occasion. A banner hung across the main entrance, Local Lives, Hidden Histories of Eastwood. Beneath it, in smaller letters, featuring the archive of Geraldine Carter. I stood still for a moment on the library steps. I had stood on these same steps before, 3 decades earlier, clutching Daniel's hand as he carried his first library card. We had taken pictures. I remembered the way his hair stuck up and how he had smiled with a gap-toothed pride. Inside, the exhibit took up the entire reading room. A long, curved table displayed artifacts under glass. The wedding photo, the letters, the napkin, the brooch, Daniel's childhood drawings. Each item was captioned in my words. People wandered slowly, reading. A few took notes. Others leaned in close, whispering. Some nodded to themselves. Near the center of the room stood a framed print of the article. Underneath it, a copy of my preface mounted on textured parchment. A box of memory, a mother's chronicle. At the end of the exhibit, there was a small desk where visitors could leave a message. The sign above it read, "If this story reminded you of someone, write to them, or write to her." I looked down. Already the bowl was full of folded notes. One woman approached me. She must have been near my age, with silver hair and warm eyes. "Are you her?" she asked. "I am." She reached for my hand. "Thank you for writing it down, for sharing it. I saw my whole life in that glass case." Others followed. They didn't ask for explanations. They didn't probe. They just said thank you, as if I had named something they had been holding in silence for years. Daniel walked beside me, silent, reading. When he reached the napkin, he exhaled softly. "I remember this," he said. I cried. I smiled. "You did. I told you it gave it character." He looked at me. "You always made things mean something." Julia stood quietly at the wall of letters. She didn't say much that day, but when we left, she touched my shoulder gently and said, "You built something beautiful." Back home that evening, I found a note on my pillow, a child's handwriting. "Grandma, your stories are better than YouTube. Love, Ellie." I laughed, and I cried, because somewhere along the way, my story had stopped being just about being forgotten. It had become about being remembered. The following week, Daniel came home carrying a copy of the Eastwood Gazette. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table beside my teacup, his fingers brushing the edge of the page with quiet reverence. "Did you see this?" he asked. I hadn't. Beneath the fold was a headline, "One Mother's Story in a Box, a Chronicle of Love, Loss, and Legacy." There was a photograph, one I hadn't known was taken, of me standing near the exhibit's centerpiece, my hand resting on the edge of the display case, eyes forward, mouth slightly open. The caption read, "Geraldine Carter, author of the featured archive, at the Local Lives exhibit opening." I scanned the article. It was longer than I expected. It quoted from the letters, described the impact of the archive, included comments from visitors. "I've never cried in a library before. This made me call my mother. This is the most human thing I've ever read in a public space." And then, near the bottom, a closing quote from Stephen. "This isn't just a family story. It's a reminder of the quiet force mothers have in shaping memory, and the injustice of how often we let that force go unrecognized until it's too late." I folded the paper with care and set it beside me. Daniel sat across the table. "I didn't know you remembered so much," he said, his voice not full of regret, but of something softer. "Wonder, maybe." I met his eyes. "I remembered everything. That's the job." He didn't argue. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I think I forgot you were a person before you were my mother." I smiled, but didn't let him off easily. "Most children do." We sat like that for a while. The clock ticked above the stove. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life continued, but something between us was still and shifting. Later that evening, Julia knocked on my door. In her hands was a shoebox. "These are mine," she said. "Old journals, photos, letters from college. I thought maybe you'd want to look at them. Help me remember things." I looked up. She added, "You're better at that than anyone." I took the box and placed it gently on my lap. "Thank you," I said. That night, I began reading through Julia's past, not out of curiosity, but as a kind of offering, a way of saying, I still have room. The next morning, Ellie came into my room carrying her notebook. "Can I write stories too?" she asked. I opened my laptop. "Sit next to me," I said. And just like that, a new archive began. Not boxed, not forgotten, but living, passed from one hand to another. Not because I insisted, but because they finally knew where to look. I hadn't expected the blog to take off. After the article in the Gazette visits to Still Here, notes from the quiet chair doubled overnight, then tripled. It was no longer just subscribers from Eastwood or neighboring towns. I began seeing names from states I'd never visited. A woman from Vermont sent a message saying she read every post aloud to her mother, who no longer remembered much, but always smiled when I mentioned apple pie. I wrote every morning now, after breakfast, after checking on the roses, before anyone needed me. It became a ritual, not a duty, but a tether, something that belonged solely to me. My voice had found its place. I didn't write to be profound. I wrote to be precise. To describe how my fingers ached after kneading dough, how the light moved across the windowsill in the late afternoon, how grief didn't shout but hummed like an old refrigerator in the corner of a quiet kitchen. One post, titled, "The Space Between the Words," got shared over 5,000 times. A university professor emailed to ask if they could use it in a seminar on aging and memory. A librarian from Oregon invited me to speak via video call. I nearly laughed at the idea, me giving a talk, but I said yes. Daniel watched all of this with a kind of quiet amazement. He helped set up the camera for my call, adjusted the lighting, said I looked like someone important. I suppose in my own small world, I had become someone important. The house changed too. My room, once an afterthought, had become a place the children wandered into with questions. "Grandma, what's a cassette tape? Why did people write letters when there were no phones? Can I hear the story about when Daddy got stuck in the fence again?" I didn't answer like a teacher. I answered like a witness. And they listened. One afternoon, Ellie brought me a drawing. It was a picture of a chair with books stacked around it, a steaming mug on a side table, and a woman with silver hair typing on a laptop. Above it, she had written, "The chair that tells the truth." I framed it. By the time summer arrived, I had been invited to contribute a column to a national newsletter for senior women. They titled it, "Voices from the Quiet Generation." I suggested they drop quiet. They did. Julia began referring to me not just as mom, but as a writer. Once, at the grocery store, I heard her telling a friend, "My mother-in-law's work is in an exhibit at the library. She has hundreds of readers now." She didn't say it with pity. She said it with pride. And Daniel, he began saving my posts, printing them out, putting them in a binder he kept in the study. I never asked why. I think he just wanted to make sure it wouldn't be lost again. I didn't need a statue. I didn't want a monument. But I had become a voice that didn't need permission to speak. Not loud, just lasting. And that, I realized, was enough. There is a shelf in Daniel's house now. It's just beside the stairs, at eye level for a child. It holds a single empty cardboard box. Nothing special about it. Brown, a little worn, the flap slightly curled from years of being opened and closed. But it sits there, undisturbed, Not filled, not discarded, just present. Sometimes when I pass by, I see one of the grandchildren peeking inside, as if expecting something new to appear. Sometimes Daniel rests his hand on it in passing. Once I saw Julia dust it carefully, her expression unreadable. I never asked why they kept it. I think I already know. Because that box is no longer about what it once held, it's about what it made possible. My life has taken a quieter rhythm again. I still write, less frequently, but with more focus. I still receive letters from strangers. Some come with stories, others come with silence, a folded note with nothing written but a return address. I answer each one. The exhibit has closed, but my archive remains at the library. They say students still come to study it, particularly those working on family history or memoir. The curator told me it's become a model for personal preservation, the story that taught others how to value their own. I visit now and then, not often. It's strange walking through your own history like a museum guest. But I go because it reminds me that none of it was wasted. Not the love, the labor, the loneliness. All of it mattered, even when no one said so at the time. At home, I spend more time with the children. Ellie has started writing her own stories, tiny ones, about cats and space travel and a grandmother who owns a talking tree. We keep a notebook together called Two Voices. She insists on drawing the pictures. Daniel still reads my older blog posts. Sometimes he quotes them back to me. One night, as we were clearing the table, he said, I reread the one about your first Christmas alone after Dad passed. I never knew you went to the church and just sat in the back pew all morning. I nodded. You were busy with the kids. I didn't want to bother anyone. He looked at me then, fully. I wish I had asked. I wish I had known what to ask. I reached across the table and took his hand. You know now, that's enough. And it is, because everything that was packed away has been unpacked. Everything that was silent has been spoken, and everything that was overlooked has been seen. In the end, I was not erased. I was not pushed out. I simply moved what mattered into the light, and the light, it turns out, is wide enough to hold it all, even me.